Have you ever felt the strange pressure of standing before someone who could change your life? Not that romantic fantasy of luck, but the real, almost physical presence of power. Imagine this now: a grand wedding, loud music, dazzling lights, conversations mingling, and in the center of this atmosphere, a rumor ripples through the room like electricity. One of the country's biggest businessmen is there, a man capable of rewriting destinies with a handshake, the kind of figure Machiavelli observed with surgical precision, not for the glamour, but for what his mere existence reveals about human nature. You know you have little time, maybe a few minutes, maybe less. And in that instant when chance pushes you forward, the question that Machiavelli would ask before any move arises: what do you really intend to achieve? Because most people, driven by the desire to please, repeat rituals that always fail. They talk about their achievements as if offering old trophies. They recount their difficulties as if begging for compassion. Or they try to wear the mask of exaggerated humility, proclaiming admiration in the hope of being noticed. But Machiavelli would call this a structural error, the confusion between intention and perception. It doesn't matter what you feel. What matters is how the other person interprets it. This is where something deeper emerges. Faced with power, you are not fighting with words, but with invisible sensations. Your presence speaks louder than any rehearsed phrase. Your gaze reveals insecurities you tried to hide. Your body betrays what your voice tries to control. And Machiavelli knows this better than anyone. The game doesn't begin when you speak, but when you appear. That's why he would whisper in your ear, "Don't approach as someone who begs, but as someone who exists. Not as a shadow, but as a presence." Perhaps you're wondering how to do this in such a short time, and that's where the tension arises. Because power doesn't reward those who try to be liked. It recognizes those who don't tremble before it. Not the arrogant, but the whole. Not the flatterers, but those who seem to understand the silent logic of influence. Before you even say a word, Machiavelli would have already diagnosed your greatest threat: the temptation to diminish yourself, to believe you need to prove your worth, to think that being accepted is the goal. But what if the goal were different? What if instead of seeking approval you learned to attract attention? Not through force, not through sympathy, but through stability, through controlled energy, through the silent audacity of someone who doesn't beg, doesn't boast, and doesn't feign weakness to inspire pity. Machiavelli would teach that power respects those who do not idolize it, and that every decisive encounter begins with a single choice: to be just another one among many, or to be the exception that no one expects. And while the music continues in the background and the entire room remains distracted, one last question arises, the question that paves the way for everything that comes after. When destiny places you before power, will you ask for it? Or will you become someone impossible to ignore? To understand what happens when you get close to power, you need to go back centuries and enter another landscape: Renaissance Florence, a fragmented territory full of conspiracies, fragile alliances, and rulers who relied more on fear than on promises. It was there that Machiavelli walked, observed, and was wounded. And it is precisely this scar that makes him so relevant to you today, because despite the different clothes, the palaces became offices, the princes became bosses, and the armies were replaced by corporate interests. But human logic, that remains intact. Nothing has changed. You see it every day, even without realizing it. Think about your workplace. There's always someone who seems to control the environment without raising their voice. A person who doesn't need to ask for attention, because attention gravitates around them. This figure is often not even the most competent, but they carry what Machiavelli described as the aura of usefulness, a presence that represents answers, not problems. On the other hand, there are those who live trying to prove their worth, seeking validation, complaining about the lack of recognition. These are easily ignored, not because they are weak, but because they convey neediness. And neediness, as Machiavelli warned, smells of vulnerability. The same dynamic appears at home, in family gatherings when someone desperately tries to convince their father, mother, uncle, or business partner. The more they talk, the less they are listened to. The more they explain, the less they are considered. Not out of injustice, but due to human instinct. Those who try too hard to justify themselves end up losing ground. Machiavelli saw this so many times that he turned it into a rule. He knew that when Someone tries to prove who they are. They reveal that they still don't believe in their own strength. And this subtle detail changes everything. But there's an even deeper layer, and perhaps you've already felt it. That strange impression that some people don't need to make an effort to be treated with respect. They enter a common environment and suddenly, everything around them seems to adjust their posture. Machiavelli would call this consolidated perception, when the image precedes the proof, when the expectation precedes the action. The opposite also happens. Have you ever noticed how someone who tries too hard usually receives the minimum? As if they were always one step behind, even if they work harder than everyone else? And then comes the twist that Machiavelli would insist you see. It's not merit that defines the game, it's reading the environment, and whoever reads it best controls it. A small gesture, a calculated silence, a seemingly irrelevant choice can alter the entire dynamic. Like when in Florence, a young stranger managed to be received by a duke simply because he didn't show urgency. His normality confused the system. The duke wanted to know why someone who didn't beg considered himself worthy of entering. Curiosity opened the door that please never could. Now think about your current life. How many doors have closed not because of a lack of ability, but because of excessive anxiety? How many opportunities have evaporated because you tried to prove, explain, justify? Machiavelli would say that you weren't rejected, you were simply misinterpreted. And it's this realization that changes everything. Because from this point on, the game isn't about being better, it's about being interpreted differently. And when that penny drops, something inside you starts to shift. The world stops seeming unfair and starts to seem decipherable. And once you understand the logic, power ceases to be distant and begins to become accessible. First impressions are a silent sentence. Machiavelli knew this when he observed the princes of Florence assessing foreigners in a few seconds before they even spoke a single word. Today, this happens in meeting rooms, in company corridors, at social events. It's not unfair, it's instinct. Power quickly identifies who brings real weight and who merely occupies space. And without realizing it, you do this too. You decide if someone is trustworthy, valuable, or irrelevant at a glance. The difference is that the powerful have transformed this perception into survival. That's why they don't listen to your justifications. They observe how you enter. It is at that moment that your presence speaks louder than your entire history. Machiavelli would say that when you approach someone influential, three judgments arise almost simultaneously. First, do you represent a cost or a gain? Then, do you bring clarity or confusion? And lastly, do you behave like someone who needs to be guided or like someone who knows how to walk? These three questions, even if never spoken, shape the course of the conversation. That's why so many talented people fail. They arrive trying to be perfect when in reality, they are only revealing insecurity. Forced perfection smells of fear, and fear repels. At this point, you might ask yourself, could it be that without realizing it, you have been presenting yourself as someone who weighs more than they contribute? And this is where an uncomfortable truth emerges. Powerful people don't have time to decipher hidden intentions. They are guided by quick signals, a hesitant gesture, an exaggerated compliment, an overly long narrative. All of these create noise that weakens their image. Meanwhile, a firm silence, a direct gaze, or a simple answer can completely alter how you are perceived. Have you noticed how some people hardly speak, yet still command the atmosphere? It's not natural charisma, it's mastery of perception. Machiavelli would call this economy of gesture, doing less to mean more. This logic also appears in situations that seem trivial, but carry enormous psychological force, like when someone talks about their own merits with too much enthusiasm. To you, it might seem like self-confidence. To someone at the top, it sounds like an involuntary confession of need. The more someone tries to prove their worth, the more they reveal that they still don't know their own worth. The curious thing is that sometimes the most prepared person in the room is precisely the one who sabotages themselves trying to convince others of this. And have you ever wondered how many times you've fallen into this same cycle? Machiavelli perceived these behaviors with disconcerting clarity. He knew that power reacts less to content and more to the emotional density that accompanies that content. Therefore, when you say, "I need this," what the other person hears is, "I depend on you." And dependence, within structures of influence, creates immediate discomfort. Now imagine the opposite, when you say little, but say it firmly, when you present yourself calmly, even in front of someone important, when you don't try to fill the silence because you don't fear the space you occupy. This changes everything, not by magic, but because it conveys the most valuable message there is, not a burden. It is at this level that the unexpected turn of events occurs. Many people believe that showing hunger opens doors, but in practice it is the absence of apparent hunger that intrigues. Power leans towards what seems self-sufficient. Machiavelli would write that, while the beggar awakens fatigue, the centered individual awakens curiosity, and curiosity is a force that moves structures. Have you ever noticed how some opportunities arise precisely when you are not desperately trying to seize them? The remaining question is simple, yet profound. What would happen if, the next time you were faced with someone powerful, you didn't try to prove anything? What if, instead of justifying yourself or showing off, you simply stood by yourself? Machiavelli would say that, at that moment, you would cease to be deciphered as an ordinary person and would begin to be read as an exception. And exceptions don't ask for space. They are inevitably noticed. Machiavelli always believed that the real mistake of those seeking to rise to power lies not in a lack of talent, but in haste. He saw princes, mercenaries, and advisors ruin entire fortunes, simply because they acted before understanding the terrain. This lesson transcends the centuries and reappears today when so many people fail not because of incompetence, but because they talk too much, act too soon, or reveal everything without realizing it. Approaching power is delicate terrain. Those who tread noisily frighten, those who tread hastily slip. That is why Machiavelli would say that, before impressing, you need to observe. Power is not won with pronouncements, but with reading. A curious example occurred in 1919 when a young Japanese man named Kokichi Mikimoto was received by European businessmen. They were suspicious of his cultured pearls, believing them to be artificial. Mikimoto didn't argue, didn't try to persuade. He simply placed a pearl on a hot iron table until it began to burn. When it turned to ashes, he calmly said, "A fake pearl would have melted." The silent, unexpected, and calculated gesture instantly changed the merchant's perception. Without apparent effort, Mikimoto resolved a distrust that words could not have resolved. Machiavelli would call this a precise action, minimal but definitive. This type of movement is rare because it requires emotional control. Many people believe they need to show everything, explain everything, convince at any cost. Excessive exposure creates noise, and noise weakens the image. Machiavelli saw advisors lose the trust of powerful rulers because they were too predictable. He said that whoever reveals everything becomes a tool, and tools are easily replaced. True usefulness lies in the combination of clarity and mystery, presence and economy. The unexpected, when well calculated, has more power than constant effort. There are also stories so improbable they seem invented, but they only confirm this logic. In 1984, a young, unknown programmer attended a meeting with major technology executives. Instead of giving a long speech, he simply showed a working prototype, even if it was full of flaws. The prototype crashed 3 times, but in the end, the investors said he was the only one who seemed to understand the direction of the future. That programmer was Steve Jobs. What convinced the room was not perfection, but focus. Jobs didn't ask for anything. He offered vision, even if imperfect. Machiavelli would recognize in this the essence of strategy, not showing that you need support, but that you represent the path. The final question is simple. What if what opens doors isn't force, but precision? What if, instead of trying to convince quickly, you learn to act like Mikimoto or Jobs, with gestures that speak louder than words? Machiavelli would say that when you learn to calculate your presence, power ceases to be distant and begins to respond to you. Because in the end, it's not the one who talks the most who wins. It's the one who knows exactly when to act who wins. Machiavelli said that power is not acquired merely through skill, but through attunement. It is not enough to do well. It is necessary to perceive the other's rhythm. He observed princes capable of reading an entire room in seconds and adjusting their own behavior with the precision of someone who knows the value of adaptation. This ability does not stem from the desire to please, but from understanding what each influential person expects, fears, or respects. And although it may seem distant, this happens in the most common places. At work, when you realize that each leader reacts differently to the same type of information. At home, when a simple tone of voice completely changes the course of a conversation. Or even in casual encounters, when certain people seem to fit immediately into the environment, while others never find a place. Machiavelli saw this as a form of practical intelligence, the most decisive of all. But there's an even more dangerous detail, and few realize when they start falling into this trap. When someone tries too hard to conform, they lose their naturalness and become a copy, and copies are never respected. True strength lies in adjusting one's posture without losing one's essence. That's why some people manage to access influential circles even without outstanding training. They don't try to be someone else. They simply reflect what the environment demands without abandoning who they are. Others, even highly qualified ones, get lost trying to impress and end up transmitting anxiety or submissiveness. Have you ever seen this happen? The competent person who, at the decisive moment, seems to shrink? Machiavelli would say that they failed before speaking because they gave up their own presence to try to fit into an imaginary mold. This is where the importance of mystery emerges. Not theatrical mystery, but the depth that isn't fully revealed. Machiavelli believed that what isn't completely revealed becomes more valuable because it awakens curiosity and respect simultaneously. Predictable people aren't seen as a threat, but neither are they seen as a possibility. Someone who reveals a little and keeps the rest becomes interesting. That's why, in any environment, there's always that figure everyone wants to understand better. They speak little, but each phrase seems calculated. They act little, but each action seems to carry intention. The right silence used at the exact moment can be worth more than an entire speech. And perhaps you've already felt this. The power that exists in not saying everything. But the real tension arises when this posture begins to take effect. Influential people, perceiving consistency, start to observe you more closely. They try to understand if you represent a risk or an opportunity. From then on, every gesture you make carries weight. And it is at this moment that many betray themselves. They want to accelerate the process, reveal more, prove more, secure space. But it is precisely in this haste that balance is lost. Machiavelli would say that the moment someone begins to be noticed is the same moment they need to act with more caution. Because when power sets its eyes on you, it is evaluating whether it is worthwhile to maintain attention or discard you as just another one. The inevitable turning point comes when you realize you're no longer an observer, but someone being observed. And that changes everything. The way you speak, react, and position yourself begins to define how you'll be ranked in the invisible game of influence. This is where strategy becomes vital. It's no longer about gaining attention, but about sustaining it without exaggeration, maintaining mystery without seeming evasive, showing value without seeming needy, being present without becoming obvious. This is the most difficult dance of all, and few manage to keep the rhythm without stumbling. And as you walk that narrow line, Machiavelli would ask a question that echoes as a warning. When power draws near, will you remain true to yourself, or will you lose yourself trying to be or what you think is expected of you? The answer will determine who you become in the outcome that approaches. Ultimately, all Machiavelli tried to teach wasn't about manipulation, but about awareness. He wanted you to see the world as it truly works, not as you wish it to be. Power isn't a distant prize reserved for a select few. It's a constant reading, a trained sensitivity, a daily choice between acting intentionally or reacting automatically. And now, after traversing this journey, you know that every encounter, every conversation, and every gesture is a silent opportunity to shape how the world reads you. The practical application of this doesn't require immediate greatness. It requires small adjustments. Observe before speaking. Enter any environment with stability, not urgency. Say less than you know and do more than you promise. Don't try to impress. Try to sustain your own presence. Adjust the pace without losing your essence. Let others discover you gradually, while you act with precision. Power respects those who move calmly, even on uncertain ground. And when you feel fear, remember the advice Machiavelli would give. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision not to let fear guide your actions. Transformation begins when you decide not to ask permission to exist, when you understand that value isn't declared, it's perceived, when you realize you don't need to prove anything to those unwilling to see, and especially when you choose the stance of someone who doesn't beg for space but builds space around them. You don't control how others think, but you control what you transmit, and that alone is enough power to change any narrative. If this content sparked reflection, if it awakened something in you, even if it's just a question, leave a like, comment. It can be a word, a symbol, or even an anonymous comment. This helps the algorithm, but mainly it helps other people find this message. And if you want to continue receiving content like this, profound, direct, and transformative, subscribe to the channel. The journey is just beginning and you are part of it.